Good afternoon and welcome to our Wednesday edition of our Holy Week Bible study. I hope you've had an opportunity to be outside on this beautiful day. I had to make a little trip over to St. Joseph's Cemetery to do an interment service today, and the dogwood and the redbud are incredibly beautiful. So I hope that wherever you are, you're able to get out and enjoy some of this extraordinary weather. We are on Wednesday of Holy Week, and we're going to begin by reading chapter 14 of Mark's Gospel, verses 1 and 2. I'm trying to see what Dan is telling me. Hold on. Oh, it's Sue and Dan. Hey, good to have you guys here. So let's go to Mark chapter 14, verses 1 to 11. And this is what we're told about that Wednesday. It was 2 days before the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. The chief priests and scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him, for they said, "Not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people." While he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, he sat at the table. A woman came with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment of nard, and she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. But some were there who said to one another in anger, "Why was the ointment wasted in this way? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and the money given to the poor." And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, and you can show kindness to them whenever you wish, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial. Truly I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. When they heard it, they were greatly pleased and promised to give him money. So he began to look for an opportunity to betray Jesus. That's the events of the day. And you can see that the passage falls into three main sections. First, there's a need for a traitor. And then the unnamed woman appears. And then we see the advent of a traitor. Now let's talk about the need for a traitor. In the ancient Jewish world that is depicted to us in our anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic upbringing, the Jewish crowd always is depicted as being around Jesus and reacting violently against him. The cries of "Crucify him" are offered as evidence. But if the crowd was so against Jesus, why was it necessary to arrest him at night with the help of a traitor? Why not arrest him in plain daylight when he was in the temple? Why not arrest him right after the entry into Jerusalem? Well, if we remember yesterday's lesson, we read, when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. The Gospel of John gives it to us with brutal clarity. When John has the religious leaders say, "If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place and our nation." And it is entirely possible that the crowds, the Romans, or both, will destroy them. The very presence of enthusiastic crowds listening to whatever Jesus said would have been deemed dangerous at any time, but especially at Passover. After a day in which Jesus and the religious leaders have been sparring with each other, the religious leaders are now in a great predicament. They realize that they cannot arrest Jesus outright during the festival of Passover. The crowds would never allow it. They will need to know when he is apart from the crowd, arrest him apart from the crowd, and execute him before the crowd knows what is happening. They will need help. They will need a traitor. Now, in order to begin to get hold of all of this, let's do just a little bit of background. And let's talk about the 12 as failed disciples. For Mark, Lent is a transformative journey from Caesarea Philippi to Jerusalem. Jesus has been trying to prepare the disciples for what will happen when they arrive. He's also been trying to prepare them individually and as a group for their own participation in that death and resurrection, that end and beginning. But the disciples keep missing the lesson. Mark's witness is that the disciples fail constantly, and it's a warning to all who ever hear or read his gospel. Failure in discipleship is rather commonplace. Mark also uses his technique of framing in speaking about the disciples. Before the journey to Jerusalem begins, we read the story of the healing of the blind man at Bethsaida in Galilee. And then, just one paragraph before the entrance into Jerusalem, we read the healing of the blind man Bartimaeus in Jericho. So between those two frames of blindness, Mark focuses on the blindness of the disciples. Then comes 3 prophetic warnings given by Jesus. Now let's just stop for a second. How is all this sitting with you? What kind of thoughts or questions are beginning to rumble around? Give me a word or two on the comment section if you have just a second, or a thought or a question. All right, let's press on. The first prophecy. Mark's journey begins with Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi. You are the Messiah, Peter says. And Jesus says, according to the New Revised Standard Version, and he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Sternly ordered. That injunction in Mark hardly ever means you got it right. Don't tell anyone. It usually means you got it wrong. Keep quiet. In other words, Peter, shut up. Peter and the others may have been imagining Jesus as a militant Messiah who would free Israel from Roman oppression using violent means, and it is this notion that Jesus seeks to discourage. As Jesus taught about his suffering and death, Peter takes Jesus to task. In return, Jesus takes Peter to task. The word used is rebuke. It's a very, very strong word. It is the same word used by Jesus against demons. The implication is that anything that deters Jesus from his mission and his destiny is in fact demonic, satanic. It is not of God. And then Mark widens the circle to the other disciples, to the crowd, and ultimately to us. Jesus says, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? To truly and authentically follow Jesus means to accept the cross, to walk with him against imperial violence and religious collaboration, and to pass through death to resurrection. And then the second prophecy comes along. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again. Mark has Jesus pass through Galilee without any distraction in order to concentrate completely on the disciples. Do the disciples learn this time? When they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What are you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued about with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Jesus is speaking about his death. They're talking about position. They haven't gotten it yet. And then the third promise comes along. They were on the road going to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. They were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. He took the 12 aside again and began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit upon him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise again." The Greek word hodos can be translated road or way. They are all on the way, or at least they're supposed to be on the way, to death and resurrection. Are the disciples on that road, or are they traveling a different way? Jesus spells out his faith, which is in fact an outline of the account of Jesus' suffering and execution that Mark will employ later on. After each of these prophecies, Mark reports an absolute failure by the 12 to understand what Jesus is talking about. James and John so miss the point that they ask Jesus to let them sit at his left and his right in glory. Let us share in your glory. How great a failure is that? Even if the disciples do not physically endure suffering and death and resurrection, metaphorically, they are called to a through death to resurrection mode of existence. It's paradoxical. It's an apparent contradiction. Bottom line, discipleship is the opposite of domination. And then comes that story that we heard again this afternoon, and which I preached on Sunday morning, the story of the unnamed woman who anoints Jesus. She has done what she could, says Jesus. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial. She alone gets it. She has heard the 3 prophecies and has responded by drawing the obvious conclusion. Since you are going to die and rise, I must anoint you now beforehand, because I will never have a chance to do it afterward. For Mark, she is the first believer. For us, she is the first Christian. She is not only the first believer, she is the model leader. She presents the very best in discipleship. And she is contrasted with Judas, who represents the very worst in discipleship. Mark gives us absolutely no hint of Judas's motives for betraying Jesus. All we know is that he was promised money. We don't even know from Mark if he ever received it. Mark continually, however, reminds us of Judas' place among the 12. Judas, one of the 12, as we read again in our passage for the day. the traitor has entered into an agreement with those who collaborate with imperial rule. And so on Wednesday, the plot is set in motion. That's where we leave it for today. Have you any ideas, thoughts, or questions that you want to pose? What seems particularly interesting? I'll give you a reminder that this afternoon at 5:30 we will have a service of evening prayer here on the Facebook page. Tomorrow, 2 o'clock, we'll be back to consider what happened on Thursday of Holy Week. We'll gather again tomorrow night at 7 for Maundy Thursday service with communion. I hope that you will have bread and wine or grape juice there in your home so that you can join with us in the celebration. We'll be back on Friday at 2 with a Bible study for Good Friday. Tenebrae on Friday night at 7 o'clock. Saturday night, we'll be here for the great vigil of Easter and kindling the Easter fire and telling again the story. So that'll be at 7, and then 2 services on Easter morning, 8:30 and 10:30. Dan has a question here. I'm going to put it on my screen down here. I can see it a little better. Dan has a question. What about the idea that has circulated for years that God has planned this and nobody had any choice? That's a good question. And it gets us back to the whole notion of substitutionary atonement and the idea that Jesus had to die so that we could live. I don't believe God sent Jesus to die. That does not sound like a God that I am familiar with. If we take the image of God as a judge and we blow that up exponentially, God as a judge, it's complicated. God's not a judge in that way. We talk more about God as a parent. What parent would send their child to die or require the death of their child? So that God had all of this planned out does not seem to me to be in play. I think the death of Jesus is on our hands, that we are the ones who are responsible. And that makes Easter God's reaction to our word, "You will not silence me. I will raise him up." So that's kind of the way I approach this whole thing. I was raised in the substitutionary atonement system, and I could never understand a God who was so cruel. It didn't make any sense. And it still doesn't make any sense to me. I had to go find a better way to think about it. And I think obedience to God led Jesus to the inevitable conclusion of his life, which was the power structures of the day seeking to silence him. It's a great question, Dan. Thank you. Others? It's kind of interesting. I'm watching myself on Facebook and there's such a delay. It's like the 5-second delay, the 10-second delay we used to have in radio. So I finish talking and then I watch myself finish talking. All right. I am grateful for your presence here today. Thank you very much for joining me. I'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and I'll look forward to seeing you this afternoon at 5:30 for evening prayer. Stay in, stay well, save lives. See you later.